Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 27 of the High Frequency Podcast. I'm really excited to bring you today's guest because it will be his first appearance on an interview-based podcast. He's done some mixed podcasts here and there for Miyoko, Perka, etc., but he's never actually done an interview-based podcast, and I've been wanting to dive into this guy's mind for a long time. He's an artist that I personally look up to for inspiration when making my own music, and I've become pretty good friends with him over the last couple of months, so I'm really excited to bring you this chat. Venda is an Australian-based DJ, producer, and engineer. He spent years refining his sound, and if you listen to his early productions up until late, you'll notice that it's evolved to this stripped-down approach that he finds himself comfortable with today. He's got a growing catalogue of releases in recent years on some of my own personal favourite labels, such as Silat Beksi's Modeight, Perceive Records, alongside hometown labels such as Unic Mantra Collective. Safe to say, Venda's become one of the most recognised and influential artists in the underground electronic music scene over in Australia. Venda's such a down-to-earth, easygoing and kind-hearted dude. I really enjoyed the chat today. I got so much out of it, and I hope that you will find it just as valuable as I did. And for all you listeners and watchers that are new here and this is your first time listening to this podcast, please do consider subscribing to either the YouTube channel or whatever audio platform that you're listening to, either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It really helps the platform grow, and this is an interview-based podcast for Australian and New Zealand-based electronic music artists. If you want to support us even further, you can write us a review over on whatever platform you're listening to, or drop a comment in the YouTube section just to let me know how you found the podcast. And if you want to support the podcast even further, you can do via our Patreon, which is via the link in the description of this podcast or the link in the description of the YouTube video. So, without further ado, please welcome to the podcast, Venda. Okay, Venda, welcome to the High Frequency Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
It's I was kind of just saying just before we started recording, this is a bit of a fanboy podcast for me. I'm a big fan of Venda. I'm a big fan of his music. As for those who are watching the podcast on YouTube, you can see they've got some of his records behind me. I couldn't fit all of them on my turntables, so they're not all there. But yeah, so this is going to be awesome because honestly, it's a guest I've wanted to have on the podcast for a long time. But it's not something that I've wanted to rush into. You know, I've these larger guests that have got quite a big following. I do want to try and space these people out, and that's primarily because I can see that they add so much value, and I still do want to sort of, you know, peek into the smaller artists in New Zealand and give them a platform as well. But as you can see from previous episodes, I'm trying to reach out to these larger artists like Venda. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and I understand you just got back from an Asia tour. How was it?
So yeah, it was my second time in Asia. First time was Japan last September, Tokyo and Osaka. So this time around, similar again, Tokyo and Osaka, but also Taiwan as well. I don't know if you've been to Japan before, but just, yeah, an amazing place. One of the most considered and most respectful places you can really go to in the world, in my experience anyway. So the minimal scene there is really healthy. You can really go out every night of the week in Japan, or particularly in Tokyo. You can go out every night of the week. There's minimal music or underground clubs really showing some type of music nearly every night of the week. So this trip around was a gig in Osaka, a party called Lark. Very good party, actually. It's run by a guy called Nishian named DJ Spot and another DJ called Yosuke. I mean, they had Margaret Degas a few months ago. They got Fumiya Tanaka this weekend. So, yeah, amazing party. Really happy to be involved with that one in a club called Circus in Osaka. So that was very cool. In Tokyo, I played at a place called R Lounge with a promoter, DJ, photographer named Yoss. He kind of helped me out with some gigs. So that was an amazing gig. And then an after hours with another crew called Accepted the next morning. I mean, look, that after party went from 6 a.m. till midday, and it was packed the whole time. So yeah, very healthy scene. They really love minimal music. I had probably not expected that the first time I went last year. I was kind of changing my sound slightly, kind of with the current trends of what's happening in underground music at the moment. You've probably noticed the shift in the past few years that house music is kind of becoming like the main genre, I guess. Not to say that minimal doesn't exist, but you've probably seen the shift happen in the last few years. So I felt that too in my own DJing and maybe in my own production. But when I got to Japan, they just were still loving the minimal music. So it was a nice, refreshing change for me to kind of dive back into some of that music. And this time around, no different. They love the darker stuff, the minimal stuff. And then, on to Taipei. That was my first time there, by a group called Evaporate. They run a record label, they run a party, podcast. Really good label, actually. Got a lot of good stuff digitally. And they've got their first vinyl release, which I'll be part of later this year, maybe potentially the start of next year. But yeah, again, super receptive crowd. Again, they'd love kind of the minimal house kind of sound there. So really successful tour. I love Asia. I'd love to go back, as often as I can. So hopefully I'm back again next year.
Awesome. That sounds awesome. Honestly, I had no idea that the club scene was so big over there. I guess you would kind of expect it, but I guess it's one of those kind of, it's a completely different culture to what you and I are from, and you just kind of don't expect that they would be into the kind of music that we like as well. So that's quite nice to know.
It's big. And I mean, also the record shopping over there, like in Sydney in particular, maybe since COVID, some of the record stores have started to dwindle. Usually when there's people don't have so much expendable money, and records is probably the first thing that they'll not be able to buy. So buying records is a luxury. Some of the stores in Sydney in the last couple of years have kind of closed down, but the record shopping in Japan is awesome. Cheap records, good records. Lots of record stores that are stocking really good stuff.
Cool. It's funny actually because I should have known that. I go on Discogs and I look at all these records that I want, and half of them are from Japan. And it just never really crossed my mind that they would have that kind of scene there. So that's quite refreshing. But no, Japan is one of those countries I have not been to. I've been to quite a bit of Asia, but not Japan. It's definitely in the bucket list.
Add it to your list, yeah.
Yeah, and the clubs will definitely be part of that list as well for sure. I did see some of your posts on Instagram. I did see the morning after the after party that you did, and that looked pretty sick. I was surprised that it was pretty raw. Like it looked like a cool place.
Yeah, and look, another thing I will mention too, is particularly in Sydney and just maybe Australia in general, some of the clubs here can be a bit the security and monitoring everything, and they're watching what you're doing and standing at the bathroom door, things like that. Japan, no security. It's a country where, particularly in the clubs that I went to, it's a place where there's just really no need for security. Everyone's kind of keeping to themselves or kind of in control of what they're doing. So like something like an after party, you'd need to have relaxed security guards because of the environment of an after party. Most people are either partying from the night before or potentially waking up and going to the after party fresh. So it's a place where people are a bit more loose, and Japan they just went for it. It was refreshing and really good. Yeah.
Awesome. So you mentioned Sydney there. Anyway, I've not been to Sydney in a long time. It's probably not there anymore, but I lived there for a little while in Glebe when I was younger, I think 2008, 2009. And I used to DJ at Le Panic, which I don't think is there anymore. It was just a bar. It wasn't exactly like a decent club. And I also used to play the Sunday morning sometimes underneath a hotel in King's Cross. It's called the
Goldfish. Bunker. Goldfish. I think the venue was called Goldfish potentially, but yeah, I think I know what you were talking about.
Yeah, it was pretty sick. It used to, obviously everyone used to go to Chinese Laundry and then go there straight afterwards. So, and I actually saw that you're playing Chinese Laundry soon.
Last weekend. Funny you brought that up.
Was it last weekend? Okay.
Yeah. So Chinese Laundry, I think it opened in the 90s. It's in a really old, like 100-year-old building in Sydney, and it closed down. Maybe at the start of COVID, or maybe it came back after COVID very briefly, but it's been closed for years, maybe 3-4 years, something like that. Funnily enough too, that was where I had my first gig in Sydney, maybe 13 years ago, I think. Yeah, so I played there last weekend, and it was, yeah, you couldn't move in there, to be honest. Like it was kind of a unexpected to see how many people are still going out in Sydney and how healthy the scene is, I guess. Like you couldn't walk in and out of one room without having to wait 30 seconds for people to move past. You could just walk into the next room. I don't know what the capacity is, maybe 500, maybe more, but yeah, it was pumping in there.
Yeah, that's insane. I don't think I ever witnessed it that full, to be honest. But this was 2008, 2009. There wasn't a break from the clubbing scene like there was during COVID. So obviously, when there isn't a break, I guess sometimes things get a little bit stale. People stop going out as much, and it's hard to pull people into the clubs. But I guess my next question was going to be, what is the scene like in Sydney at the moment? Is it healthy, or is it kind of being up and down? What's going on?
Look, I would say now, yeah, it's healthy. I think everywhere around the world had a bit of a dip after COVID or during that period. Particularly in Sydney, venues closed, things weren't viable anymore. We've had it rough in Sydney probably for the past maybe 8 to 10 years because we've had lockout laws, um, and yeah, just venues shutting. We only have a few venues that we can use or get access to in Sydney at the moment. But I would say that the scene here um, at the moment is healthy. I mean, I think my first year clubbing in Sydney was around 2007, 2008, kind of similar to timings to what you said. And this was a time where you could go out to one venue, leave, go to the next venue, go to the next venue. You could go to 5 venues in one night, finish up at 10 a.m. at the Spice Cellar, which was a seminal kind of club when I grew up. I did an apprenticeship on that dance floor over a few years, but yeah. So since then, I mean, we had so many DJs in Sydney at that point, and this was make me sound old, but this is at a point where before social media, you would have to get. It was a weekly magazine that they would hand out um, at some record stores, even at the train station. They would hand out this magazine. It was called 3D World, and it had a section in there about all the gigs that were coming up that weekend. So you'd look through and say, okay, we can go here at 10 p.m. We'll go over here at 1 p.m. to see this DJ. We'll go to this club at 4 a.m. to see this DJ and finish off at the Spice Cellar from 6 a.m. till it closed. So, yeah, like from when I started, it's obviously not like that anymore. This is kind of now in an environment where you go out to the one venue and you kind of stay there. Um, but yeah, those early days, um, yeah, Sydney was thriving. That was kind of the golden era for my generation anyway of people. But yeah, these days, speaking about minimal music or kind of underground music, kind of the stuff that I play or I'm into, there's still in Sydney. I mean, Sash, the big players, they still do a lot of touring of a lot of the big international artists. They had Cosman just on or yesterday on Sunday night, so they're still doing a lot of big tours. Um, in Sydney. I guess some of the parties that paved the way for this sound too, Mantra Collective, good friends of mine, they kind of slowed down a little bit now. Telly, who lives in Melbourne, still kind of runs Mantra, but yeah, in their heyday, probably 2010 to or maybe a little bit later than that, but anyway, probably in the last 10 years, they kind of brought that minimal underground sound to Sydney. They did a lot of touring of a lot of the big artists, all the big Romanian guys, some guys from Berlin. So yeah, so that paved the way in a lot of respects to a lot of the young minimal DJs or the minimal house DJs in Sydney. And then as people got older, things shifted, and Mantra Collective kind of slowed down slightly. Another party called Moonshift, run by a guy called Nadeem, he kind of took that place in a way. So he started doing a lot of the touring. I think they did Dewalter, they did Per Hammer, they did a lot of big artists as well. So yeah, like the Sydney scene is healthy. I can see maybe a changing in the guard. As you start to get slightly older, you see a lot of younger people, new brands, new parties, new energy, I guess, for different things. But yeah, I mean, we have a lot of good festivals in summer in Sydney too. Maybe not so much in Sydney, but kind of north and south of Sydney. Subsonic, obviously, been one of the biggest ones for us in the past, yeah, 10, maybe 12 years. Always touring some of the biggest artists. They got Zip, They've got a bunch of the top guys this year playing. Another cool festival that's only relatively new, this will be their second one, is called Skydance. It's an all local festival. It has a bit of a range of music, anywhere from down tempo to kind of house to minimal techno, all that type of stuff. And yeah, so between the festivals, between the club gigs, like I said, Sasha taking care of a lot of that. Another really good party in Sydney, they're doing a lot of touring to, is Bag, Be Avant-Garde. They do a lot of big artists, maybe a little bit more electro in that kind of sound. But yeah, on a whole, I would say Sydney's in a good spot.
Yeah, that sounds good. There's so much I want to touch on there. I guess the first thing is, back when, I guess, 2009 to, 2008, there was a guy who you may be familiar with who actually got me into minimal at the time, called Murat Kilik.
Well, he owned the Spice Cellar, so
well,
yeah,
there you go.
that's
Okay,
who
yeah.
it
So
is.
I know when I first heard him play, I was like, "What is this?" I didn't really get it at the time because I was at the time I'd kind of come from the UK where I'd gone to clubs and been really into the big build-ups and drops and stuff like that. As my first kind of clubbing experience led the way into Sydney, and then and then I saw this guy play, and I was like, I don't understand it, but I like it. It's really repetitive, but that's cool. And it's like, I just really vibe with it at the time, and I've never looked back. I've loved minimal ever since. Obviously, minimal as a genre has changed quite a bit since then, as you probably realize. But yeah, but Sash wasn't around at that point. Obviously, I've had Kerry on the podcast, and he I think he was in London at that point, but he's doing something great there in Sydney. The parties. You've obviously played at many of them, and they do a really good job on social media, and obviously drag the crowd in. So it's good to
Yeah,
hear.
yeah, and look, just touching on that too, I would say I wouldn't be the DJ or the music lover I would be now if it wasn't for Murat and the Spice Cellar, like that. Just finding out about that place, like I think I was maybe 19, 20 years old, and it was like at that time, having a place you'd go to at 10 a.m. in the morning was unheard of for me anyway. Like I was only young, and having the ability to stay out somewhere till 10 a.m. was just like mind blowing to me. And Spice always felt like it was like this secret little club. Like it would sound funny even to say now, but you were kind of screened at the front door. Like if they didn't like the way you looked, or if you weren't with the right people, they'd be like, nah, not tonight. Kind of in a way like the Berghain is, but on a much lower level. But it just felt like you were in a cool spot. And yeah, that's where some of the residents in particular of Spice back in those days are still some of Sydney's best DJs. Some of them aren't around anymore, but yeah, man, that was where the best music was in Sydney for sure. And Sash happened not long after that. I mean, that was kind of the next phase of Sydney. But I think they maybe existed at the same time briefly. But yeah, Spice into Sash, they were the two big parties.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned Mantra as well. I mean, I don't know Telly, but I did go to, I was over in Melbourne in November last year, and I went to one of his nights at Sub Club, which was pretty cool. Pretty cool club. I was a little bit, I don't know, maybe I had some big expectations for the sound system in there, but it was a little bit disappointing. I don't know.
I haven't been to Sub Club, but they do have Melbourne scene in compared to Sydney. They have probably um, it's similar in a way. Similar, Sydney and Melbourne are similar in a way. They probably have a couple of bigger venues. They've got maybe some more consistent parties that happen. Um, yeah, and maybe a few more venues, I'd say. So I haven't been to Sub Club there, but Telly still runs Mantra. Like he had Cosman on Saturday night, so he's still running. He had DeWalter maybe early this year, I think, as well. So yeah, Telly's really enthusiastic member of the scene. So he's still running parties when he can, still keeping Mantra Collective alive. Yeah.
Yeah, nice, nice. It's funny as well because you mentioned that obviously in Sydney it was quite common practice to go from club to club to club in one night. When we were clubbing, I guess in the UK, um, uh, we used to go to one club and stay there until it closed, and then go to a day club. It wasn't really a thing that you did in the UK to hop around like that. So that's pretty cool. That you're able to hop around so easily. I guess the club scene in the UK is not really that as accessible like that. It's more so you go to one venue and you kind of stay there, and you really make the most of that one venue. So that's quite interesting. Have you spent much time in the UK?
Uh, I have been twice. My mother was born in the UK, so I'm actually a dual citizen. I got a
Oh
UK
yeah,
passport,
nice.
but I played couple of gigs over there on my last trip. So yeah, haven't spent too much time, but yeah.
Cool, cool. So, let's dive into you. So, obviously, we've talked a lot about the club scene in your Asia tour, more than I probably anticipated. But I find it really interesting just to hear about the Sydney scene because I don't know, man. I mean, you've played over here in New Zealand, and it's it's just there's a scene. It's just very small. There's not as many clubs. It's kind of died here in Wellington, where I'm based. So it's a little bit kind of I'm almost longing for Sydney. um, but yeah, look, every single time I get someone on the podcast, I always want to give them a chance to sort of tell their story and kind of how they got into it. And you've mentioned a couple of points there from back when you met Murat and you used to do the clubbing thing in Sydney. But how did you get started in the whole DJing and production thing? Like, what was your catalyst into that, and kind of how did that grow from there?
Okay, good question. So I would say I kind of came from a musical family. My grandfather was a famous jazz musician. Um, my mum and dad used to always play music growing up, so my memories growing up were always music related, whether it was kind of slow rock or even music I listen to this day, to be honest. But I was always came from a musical background. Always listened to music growing up, but I didn't wasn't one of those guys that listened to dance music. I didn't really find electronic music till I was 19, which was via a Ministry of Sound CD. I think it was the 2007 annual or something like that. Um, Kind of the electro trash era. So it was like Daft Punk and Mastercraft and just like yeah, that trashy kind of electro of that era, which was cool at the time. Trust me. But yeah, that was kind of my introduction to it, and that ties into what I said before about first going out clubbing in Sydney in 2008. I think 2008, 2007, 2008. Roughly when I started DJing. So I got into the electronic music within 12 months. I wanted to buy some decks and see what I could do. Um, and at that time, uh, there was a group of DJs in Sydney called the Bang Gang DJs, and it was five DJs or five or six DJs, and they just play kind of crazy back to back sets all through Sydney. And that's what I mentioned before about you could go see Bang Gang play, and because there was five of them, they'd branch off. So you might get two of them at one club, and you might go see them another one of them at another club. So we would just hop around the different clubs, chase around these DJs, and we were big fanboys of them. Um, it's funny now. Me, when I DJ, if I see young kids, I always try to take the time to be respectful, be nice, because I was that person that was hanging over the rafters, watching the DJ, watching every move they made. So yeah, but yeah, it was just an obsession with how it all worked, I guess. So getting turntables or getting CDJs at the time, they were CDJ 800, so they were the CD only CDJs, and yeah, from there started with all that music of the era, like I said. So it was a lot of kind of yeah, that heavy electro kind of sound of the time. Um, Funny too, when I got CDJs, this was before YouTube tutorials, so I actually had no friends that DJ'd at the time, just me and one other guy that had kind of started, and uh, we had kind of self-taught, like it wasn't that difficult. But there's a funny story. I remember, I think I'd been maybe DJing or bedroom DJing for maybe 6 months, and I thought I was ready to record a mix. So again, probably too embarrassed to ask anyone how it works. You got to figure it out for yourself. And it was kind of taboo. Like the other DJs didn't really talk about it at that time. That were my friends anyway. So I remember I wrote down the track list on a piece of paper, and I wrote down, it was two pieces of paper. On the left side was the track I'd play on the left CDJ, and on the right bit of paper was the track I'd play on the right, with the timing of when I mix out and the timing of when I mix in on these two tracks. And I got about 25 minutes in, and the mix started to go out of time. And I thought, damn it, I don't know how to DJ, because no one told me you could just touch the jog wheel to move the sound back into time quickly. So this is how inexperienced, and I laugh at it now, but these days you could, most everyone's a DJ. That's kind of the term that they say. So you could learn from a friend. You could go on YouTube and learn what I didn't know in 30 seconds. So yeah, it was a time when I didn't really have many friends doing it. We kind of just baby stepped it through. Yeah, but I guess from there too, um, you go through all the different, like the wave of styles of music. Like I started off with the electro sound, somehow got from there to tech house. Maybe not so much what you consider today's tech house, but tech house of then, like 2008, 2009 tech house. Um, I remember hearing like a Jamie Jones, Lee Foss mix, and that got me into deep house of the time. That was like 2010, I think. And then got into minimal after that. And probably around the time I started making music, I think maybe I started making music 2009, 2010, which was deep house at the time. My first EP came out a bit later, but yeah, my first EP was deep house. So that's kind of where I started my production, and then it went into minimal, and it's kind of been there ever since, whether it's minimal house, whether it's a bit more darker minimal, whether it's, yeah, kind of around that. But yeah, change the subject slightly, sorry. But DJing wise, yeah, that's kind of, that's where the love grew from it, just watching DJs play, being obsessed with how it worked, and then just kind of going on the journey from there.
Yeah, yeah. That's honestly that you see me nodding so much because I'm like, yep, that's exactly what happened to me. Yep, that's exactly. It's just that that kind of that electro-y sound that, like, we used to call it really dirty electro, but that kind of like really like completely different to today's electro. But yeah, I used to love that sort of stuff. And then yeah, exactly the same thing. Heard Jamie Jones, and then I was really into the whole creation sound. And I think it's like a natural process, because it's kind of like, if you think about music that you and I love today, I I honestly think it kind of requires a developer a level of, and I hate to use the word, but maturity of taste, I guess. Because if I took one of your tracks and I went to someone in Wellington who said to me they liked house music, they probably wouldn't get it. They'd be like, it sounds the same all the way through, but it doesn't sound the same all the way through, because it takes, like I said, a level of maturity to sort of understand that sound. So at what point during that journey did you start to develop the sound that you have today? Because it is a specific sound, and obviously you can tell by the level of detail that you have in your music that you've refined that over a long period of time. So how did that kind of manifest itself?
So I think I was DJing for probably 3 years before, yeah, a couple of years before I realized that I wanted to start to make my own music. And again, at that time, there wasn't YouTube tutorials on how to make a house track in 30 minutes or 60 minutes or something like that. The access to YouTube was only in its early days. So um, I enrolled at university for a sound engineering degree. It was a 3-year bachelor degree in sound engineering. So, uh, yeah, this was before Ableton Live School, before a lot of that stuff. So this was really, I hadn't probably even at the time Googled how to make music or something like that. And this is where it led me to. So I did a course at JMC, which is a small creative kind of university, private university in Sydney. I think they're all around Australia also. But yeah, studied a degree in sound engineering, which at the time, I think there was 30 kids in my class, and 28 of them were either drummers or guitarists. And there was me and one other kid that were into electronic music. So the course, we did one kind of class on electronic MIDI and stuff like that, but it was majority of the time was recording. But what I took out of it the most was mixing. So you learn about compression, you learn about EQ, you learn about early mastering, or kind of just how to identify things in mixes that aren't right. So just building your ear and understanding what works, I guess. So yeah, so at the back of that, I think I'd been making music for 3 years before I had my first release. which would have been 2013, 2014, which, like I said before, was kind of a deep house EP, a digital EP on a record label called Black Key Records. They're from the UK. So yeah, I spent 3 years kind of before I released any music working on it. And then that's when my sound changed. So from that EP, there's kind of a 2-year gap between my next EP, and that's when the whole Jamie Jones kind of deep house kind of movement came through. And at the back of that, I started to fall in love with minimal, I guess, through a friend of mine at the time, part of Mantra Collective at the time. His name's Jack, and he was into like kind of dark David G. Tronic and like Vid at the time, Romanian producer Vid, and just that's where it all changed for me, kind of thing. And that's where my production ideas changed. And then I've kind of been there ever since, I guess. So, but yeah, to answer your question about the sound, I don't think you ever deliberately try to make a sound for yourself. It's just something that happens. The way I make music, it just falls together. And then, when you first start making music, you want your peers to like it. That's kind of the main thing. You want people around you to like it. Your friends, obviously, they're going to say it's great, but you want your peers or people that make music or ears that you trust to like it. And from early on, that people would always say, "Oh, I could tell it was your track," even if friends were DJing it at different events. They said, "Oh, that's a Venda track," or they could identify it pretty quickly. And I didn't know if I liked it at the time. I didn't know if I think it maybe got in my head, and I would try to change how I worked or change. But yeah, now it's stuck with me. Kind of people always say, "Oh, I heard one of your tracks last night. I don't know what track it was, but I could just tell it was yours." So it's just something that you build over time. I guess you just build an identity or a way of working, and that just kind of defines your sound, I guess.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that. A couple of a couple of newer producers here in New Zealand have asked me recently, how do you develop a sound? And it's a question I can't answer. It's almost like, and I don't know why they're asking me, because my sound's changed so much over the last 3 years. It's incredible. The I don't know, and part of my next question is kind of what I'm about to say. I did release some music. I released some music on Robin Fett's label, Need Records, and then also I don't know if you know Daniel Kuda from Melbourne. He owns Milk Crate Records, small digital label. He's a good lad. I don't know how I got in touch with him, but I released some music on his label as well. And I look back to that music and I'm like, I should have just been a little bit more patient, because it doesn't resemble me anymore. So I guess, how important do you think it is to wait to release music? And if there is any recommendation in that space, what would it be?
Look, the way I think about it, I can listen back to nearly every one of my releases and nitpick something that I don't like about it or whatever. But I think before you have a body of work out there, you would think that would matter. You would think people would care, but it doesn't matter. I mean, usually no one's going to go back to a release I did 3 years ago and think, oh, this sucks, or this is no good. So um, yeah, I always thought too, and people ask me, if I'm talking to younger producers or if they're asking me advice for things, um, there's two ways to look at it. You can be patient and you can wait until you're ready, or when you think you're ready. But this idea of waiting till your music's ready, it's never going to be ready. So yeah, the idea of if you wait and you're going to come out of a bang and it's going to change your life, yeah, that could happen to you, definitely. But I think you've just got to be vulnerable sometimes. You've got to put your music out there, send it to people, and just believe in yourself in a way as well. Like you've got to start building up a body of work, even if your first releases aren't amazing. You have to have done that to be able to look back and say, oh, I could have made this change, made this change. Um, like an artist that would paint a painting, like you might look back at some earlier work and think, oh, that's no good, but this kind of makes who you are. So if you were to come out of the gates bang with the best EP ever in your first EP or your first few EPs, then great, that's amazing, but it doesn't really happen like that. Yeah, be patient, but don't be too patient, I guess.
Yeah, great advice, and something I continually struggle with, patience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit about your records, because you've got a ton of them out there, and obviously, there might be some people that are listening to this podcast who haven't heard you before and maybe haven't heard what records you've got out there. So you don't need to list every single one. I know we've got a couple behind me, but what labels have you released on? Why? And I did notice that you something that I aspire to do at some point when I when I feel like my music's ready, whenever that may be, is consistently release on vinyl. And with the disposable nature of digital music these days, I'm presuming that was a conscious choice.
Uh, yeah, like it's a good question. That was part of the scene at the time. I think like all the best records were getting released on vinyl. I think my first vinyl EP was in 2018. Um, so at that time, it was a time when digital Beatport had a bad name. Digital music had a bad name. It was a period where all the records were, particularly in the minimal house scene, were vinyl only. So as a producer, that is kind of the trophy that you work towards in a way. Like you said, there's really nothing tangible about a digital release, and music can become disposable pretty quickly. So, kind of working towards having a record, at least a 12-inch record, was like the trophy at the end of the experience, I guess. So, um, yeah, I spent probably 4 or 5 years just doing vinyl releases. I didn't have any digital releases during that period, but now it's changed. Now I understand the value of giving access to everyone to have your music. It's not just a private boys club where if you don't have the record, you can't have access to the music, which kind of, I think that's why there was a change. It was getting a bit too, not everyone can afford to buy a record. Not everyone has turntables. And there's a lot of good music that a lot of people don't have access to that were just vinyl only. Um, but yeah, so releases wise, as far as my story goes, I would say that everything kind of changed for me, or not changed, but everything kind of started for me. I think it was 2016 when I had an EP on body parts. And that was a digital EP, but that was kind of a turning point just in my journey, or my production journey, which actually, funny story behind this. So that EP happened through a friend of mine in Sydney was friends with Archie Hamilton, and he came to my house at the time. It was like a Saturday afternoon. We had some drinks, and uh, my friend Tommy had said to Archie, "Oh, Dave makes music. You should hear some." And he said, "Yeah, cool." So at the time, I burnt him a CD. This, I think, was probably before USBs were like something you could just give away at that point. But I burnt him a CD of some of my demos, gave them to him, and that was the end of it. And I think maybe a couple, I didn't think much of it. And then maybe a month later, he reached out to me and he said, "Hey, can you send me those files digitally? I don't have the CD. I'm playing a gig," or whatever it was. So I sent him the files. Again, didn't hear anything from it, didn't think much of it. And then um, friends of mine were at off Sona party in Barcelona, I think it is. And Dubtail was playing, and they heard one of my tracks, like friends of mine that knew my music, and they were like, "Whoa, what the hell?" So they took a video, sent it back to me, and I was like, "Well, okay, so something's happened here." And um, I reached out to Archie and said, like, "Did you give my music around?" He said, "Yeah, I gave it to Body Parts, like Olga and at the time Dennis, and they gave the CD to Dubtail, or gave the files to Dubtail, and they said, 'We're so glad that you got in contact.'" Anyway, Archie put me in contact with them, whatever, and they said, "Oh, we're so happy that you got in contact with us. We got given a blank CD with no names on it." Um, so from there, the EP got signed, and then it went on to get played around at different parties. But um, yeah, so I know that's not the question you asked, but I would say like a big part of having any success is just about meeting people, and it's kind of like getting a job too. If you tried to get a job where you just send a resume into a random company, you're probably not going to get that job. But if you know someone, that's kind of how it works. So um, yeah, my advice really in that respect is you've just got to you've got to meet people, you've got to give your music to other DJs to get them to play it, I guess, if that's what you want, if that's what you're working towards. You've got to give your music to DJs for them to play it, for you to get noticed. That's kind of a big bit of advice I think I learned early on. But anyway, to answer your question, from there, so from that EP, things changed slightly. I then had a vinyl release on Subsonic. I mentioned the festival before. They also had a record label, and then I got Archie involved, and he did the remix on that record. So that was my first record in 2018. And then from there, it was a period where I don't think it happens as much anymore. I haven't noticed as much anymore, but it's a period where every record you would have maybe a smaller artist, for me at the time, with a bigger remixer to bring kind of attention to your records. So those next couple of releases I had out, Dubtil did the remix on the next one, obviously because he played my music. So we reached out and said, do you want to do a remix? And Dubtil did a remix on my second record. That was on Norse Project. I think it's a now defunct label, but that happened there. I can't remember every single record, to be honest, but the next kind of big one, and probably still my favorite record to this day, is on Silat Beksi's label on Modeight. And again, that was a big changer. There you go. That was a big change for me too, just in exposure. And Silat's such a lovely guy. We got to spend some time together a few years ago, and we got on really well. We've always chatted, but meeting him face to face and just building a relationship with him has been good. So yeah, that was a big change, or a big turning point for me too. Just getting my music in more people's hands and getting more exposure, I guess, from there.
That's such a sick record as well, by the way. Like, I absolutely love that one. It's fantastic.
Well, that was still my favorite. For the reason why that happened after I went to Sunwaves and just came home so full of inspiration. Just that EP kind of just fell out of me, really. That EP was done in a couple of weeks or a month, I think. And Silat signed it straight away. Didn't have any questions. He just said, please send me the mix downs, let's go. So yeah, that was a amazing experience just to have that happen so quickly. And then to this day, still probably my favorite record.
I do love that record for all different reasons, but mostly just because it's the exact kind of music that I've always loved since the clubbing days, where it's got to 4 a.m, 5 a.m, things are starting to get a little bit weird, and you hear that kind of stuff, and it's all chuggy, and it's just awesome. Love it. Probably my favorite track by you though is actually Surplus, which is on Microorbit.
Yeah. So again, that's Michele, who owns that label, Italian guy. He lived in Australia for a year or maybe 2, and we became really good friends. He came to my house, and I introduced him to my parents and my wife's parents. So he became a really good friend of mine, and that EP happened before he came to Australia. But I would say that song ties in with that Modeight EP. That's kind of in a similar, really detailed, a lot of layers, a lot of things going on in that track, but still kind of minimal house, still a lot going on, but not a lot going on, if that makes sense.
It's still, I would describe the track as it's got a groove that continues through the entire track, and you focus primarily on that groove, but it's got so many changes either side of that groove throughout the entire track. And what one thing that I love about your tracks, and something that I want to get into production wise, is when an artist, when they start producing music, I know I can take this from my own experience. I always thought that you created the groove out of simple drum elements, hi-hats, claps, a little bit of cushion, kick. But you create your grooves out of sounds that you would never expect to hear in the place that you put them. And I guess coming onto the production side of things, like, do you have any sort of go-to methods for creating those kind of sounds, or does it just normally happen by accident?
Okay, good question as well. So I start all my tracks in a very traditional way, kick drum first. It's always just been the way I've always started making music, and build my drums and bass from there. It's pretty rare that I would work with the sound first. Like, maybe I would have an idea of something, but I'm not really someone that is walking through the park and has an idea of a melody and goes to the studio and tries to recreate it. It's more just I got to throw everything at the wall and then start stripping it back. So, but to answer your question, over the years I've built up a pretty big sample library of sounds, and these days I'm pretty much primarily working in a Eurorack setup or a modular setup, and I'll record sounds on that. So I might spend an hour just recording weird little bleeps or little alien sounding sounds or whatever it is. And I've built up, pretty huge library of modular or sounds. So when I start to sit down and make a track in the box, I'm diving into this sample library and just pulling out little bleeps and sounds, time stretching them, like cutting them up. And I don't really know if it's a deliberate thing I do, but I'm just starting with bass and drums, so the rhythm of the track, and then I'm just pulling in all these bleeps and sounds, and before you know it, there's something there. So there's no real actual method. It's a deliberate choice that I do to find these weird sounds that that excite me, I guess. But yeah, I'm just, like I said, it's kind of just throwing everything at the wall. So I put a bunch of sounds in a project and strip it back until it sounds somewhere that I like.
Yeah, nice. That's a really good method. So, with you working with a modular setup, I presume that's taken some time to learn. How did you find that?
So initially, I got into modular through DeWalter and Dennis Kadshaniv from Nerve Music. So at that time, I was just fascinated with just sounds that I'd never heard before in music, and not even knowing them personally at the time, just seeing videos of their music and trying to work out how the hell did they make that sound, and landed at Eurorack. And I think I've been building my setup for maybe 8 years now. And I'm still learning. I don't know what I'm doing half the time. And I think you can say that to everyone. I've had this conversation with DeWalter since then. And yeah, sometimes you just, plugging things in and turning the knob and hoping for the best. So, it's a learning process. It's, if you're going to start that journey, be prepared. There's a lot of YouTube tutorials and there's a lot of reading manuals. And also you changing your idea of how your modular setup works over time. So you're buying modules and then you're selling them and replacing them because they didn't exactly do what you wanted them to do, or you want a different sound. So it's a moving process always. But yeah, you just basically sit in front of this thing like a big toy, press all the buttons, plug everything in, and just hope for the best sometimes. So that's kind of when the magic happens.
Would you say that is a method from keeping your process from getting stale? Because I know that some people, I mean, I'm primarily in the box right now. I've sold a couple of pieces of hardware and I'm kind of enjoying my time in the box, but I know at some point it's going to get kind of like, oh, the mouse again. I just want to touch something. Something has to be tangible in the process as well. So, how important would you say hardware is in the process? Because I know it's not essential, but for you and your recommendation, how important would you say it is?
Look, I would always say learn the tools that you have first of all. So you don't need machines to make music. You'd be surprised to find out that some of your favorite producers just use a keyboard and a mouse, and I do too a lot of the time. I'm primarily in the box. Same as you. Over the years, I've had drum machines, I've had synthesizers, but now I've just condensed it down to one Eurorack system, and I don't use it um, kind of live while I'm making music. I'm just turning it on for an hour, recording sounds into audio, and then that, like I said before, goes into a folder that I pull out when I'm actually sitting in front of the computer. I work the quickest with the keyboard and a mouse. I'd say, if anything, having a studio with drum machines and synthesizers slows down the creation process. It's fun, and don't get me wrong, I love that scenario, and I love making music. But like anyone that does that probably spends some time afterwards in the box arranging, cutting things up, doing whatever. So it's not necessary. You don't need machines. But I think just my obsession with trying to make weird sounds is where I landed on modular. And it doesn't it doesn't get boring. There's always a new sound happening or a new way of doing things. So yeah, that's what keeps me interested.
Something that is really underestimated, in my opinion, is purposeful sound design sessions. And it sounds like you've actually implemented that. Have you been doing that since day one, or is that something you've learned over the years?
Yeah, just there's different times I'm doing different things when I'm making music. I will say though, because I studied sound engineering, I have that background. I don't really have a mix down session like some people might at the end because I'm always doing that as I'm going. Some people might work really quickly, so they'll sit there and the ideas come out, the melodies, the bass lines, whatever it might be, come out really quickly, and then at the end they fine tune everything. But because I've always had that like technical background, I'm always mixing down the track as I'm going. So yeah, at the end I might just like check over everything to make sure it sits correctly. But I'm always doing that. I'm always deliberately making sure everything sits right. Really like a analytical way of thinking about it. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, sound design sessions. Yeah, so yeah, I do. I don't really have a mix down kind of session at the end, but there's times where I just decide, okay, let's work on this. Let's work on trying to get cool pad sounds, or let's work on trying to get cool percussion sounds. So yeah, I do have times where I'm just not focused on starting and finishing tracks. There is times where I'm just, you know, having fun, just trying to figure out different sounds and build up my library of knowledge, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Something I've been experimenting with recently is actually not mixing the project as I go, because what I found was, I mean, I don't have a qualification in audio engineering like you, but I found that it was slowing me down a lot. And once I was starting to mix things, I would lose my creativity, and it would just kind of stop at that point. So I guess whilst you do mix down the project as you go, do you have any methods that you can share for speeding up the process of making a track so it doesn't take you months to finish one track?
Yeah. So some advice I was given early on, I don't know, maybe I read it in a magazine, Future Music magazine, back in the day, but um, I work in arrangement view. I don't work in session view in Ableton. I don't know if you use Ableton. It's kind of like the common software, but I work in arrangement view always. So the way I structure my music is you can get stuck in loop jail or loop hell if you work in arrangement view. You can just be forever making loops and really not progressing past the point of the loop. And tons of producers asked me how to get through that. And some advice that I read or I was given early on was I finish every project that I start. So if I open up a project, say it's called July 2024, I'll see that project through to the end. Even if I started out and it was minimal house and I ended up in techno, I still finish every track that I open, every project that I open, I'll see it through to the end. I guess for the reason that you can't really improve or look back at a loop, but you can look back at a track you finish. So you can't really look back at a body of work if you don't have the body of work. So I always see through every track that I start. If it takes a week, if it takes a day, if it takes 3 weeks, I don't open another project in Ableton until that one's finished, just as a rule to myself for not getting stuck in loop jail, which is where you can get stuck. And I work in arrangement view because I can visually see the track from start to finish. So I can see the intro, I can see the ending, I can look at it and kind of envision, this is the breakdown, the first breakdown, this is the second breakdown. So I can visually look at the track and progress. If I'm in session view looking at just triggering loops, that's not a song for me just yet. So I'm always working in session view to force myself to see the finished track and then see it through, I guess. Yeah.
So you just mentioned that you don't start another track until you've just finished the one that you've started, which is really interesting. I don't know anyone that does that, so big respect for doing that. What happens if you get halfway through that project and you just lose interest and you kind of lose a little bit of inspiration, or you've lost your creativity for that particular project? What happens then? What do you do?
Delete channels I don't like, and until I find something I like. I'm not I'm not saying I don't ever move on. Like if I put a lot of time into a project, um, and yeah, I've hit a wall, then yes, I'll probably move on if I'm just frustrated with it not going anywhere. But I would say 9 times out of 10, I always finish the project. Uh, yeah, just out of a rule, just like I've always kind of kept to myself that yeah, I didn't want to just be stuck. So many producers say, oh, I've got all these different projects I need to finish or I need to finish. I'm like, oh, that just kind of gives me anxiety a little bit. I need to be able to finish the track, and even if I might not even test the track out in the club, or I might not even send it to friends, but I've just moved on from that process, and then I can get to the next track, I guess. So, yeah.
So, I guess I've got two questions, but the first one being, seeing as though you do finish so many tracks, because I definitely get stuck in loop jail, um, you do finish a lot of tracks. What process do you go through to decide whether that track is worthy of going out to a label or not? And the second part to that question is, how do you send that to the label? What do you do to communicate with them?
Um, I think I just know. I could just tell if I'm dancing in the studio while I'm making a track, then I know. You know, I've made a few tracks at this point, so I can just tell that there's some that I finish and I know definitely for sure. But I don't necessarily work quick, and I also don't force myself to work in any way as well. So, you know, there'll be periods where I'll go weeks without opening Ableton. I don't really if I don't feel creative, I don't bother. I don't just sit there and force myself to make music. So sometimes I'll make 3 tracks in the space of 2 weeks, and sometimes I'll go 2 months without making a track. That's just how it works for me. It's never something I've really forced, but I can just tell as I build up my unreleased folder or the music that I haven't signed, I can look through that list, and at the moment I've probably got about 10 tracks that kind of float in between this list, and there's 4 in there that I could make an EP out of. So some of the tracks I know aren't great, but then sometimes I'll surprise myself. I'll hear, you know, sending my tracks to, you know, my friends or other producers, and then they'll be like, oh, I love this one. And sometimes it'll surprise me. I'm like, oh, okay. Like I didn't think there was anything there, but they'll be like, no, I love this. Or even I'll hear my music in another scenario, or I'll hear another DJ playing. I'm like, I never thought there was anything there. So it kind of goes back to what I said before about being vulnerable and sending your music out, getting it into people's ears that you respect, your peers or other DJs, and you never know. You might think, oh, I don't love this part, or maybe I can improve there, but someone else hears it and they love it. So it's about being vulnerable, putting your music out there. But yeah, going back to your other question about how to, you know, knowing when to send music to labels. I don't really. I don't send my music to labels. I guess I just send them to other DJs and friends. Some of them also own their own labels, so that can lead into releasing music as well. But yeah, there's a period in your production journey, I guess, where you make music for a few years and you think you're at the point of releasing it. You start sending your demos to labels, and then you know you get your first release, or you get your first few releases, and that's great. And then there'll be a period in time where that will shift, and then instead of you sending your music to labels, labels will start coming to you, and then that's the next shift in the time. And then labels start coming to you, and then you might not have the music for that particular label, or even any music in the bank to give them. So eventually it shifts, and then it can shift back. You know, like then labels stop contacting you, and then you've got to then think about how you start releasing things. So I'm by no means, you know, the best producer in the world, so it's not constantly emails coming into my inbox saying, please, can we release your music? But it changes around, I guess. Yeah, sometimes I send tracks to other producers and they're like, oh yeah, there's something here, and then other times you don't get a response back, which doesn't necessarily mean you're doing the wrong thing. It just didn't resonate with them, I guess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this is a conversation that I've briefly had with Herman, who owns Sounds of Serious, who you've released on. Good friend of mine. Obviously, he reaches out for people's music. He's actually kind of disappointed that people don't send him music. I think at some point he'd like people to send him music, but he's just like, yeah, no one sends me anything. I have to reach out. But as a result, he gets some pretty decent artists on his label. So yeah. So last bit on the production that I really want to dive into is I guess we all go through these creative slumps, slumps where we need to take a break. We're not getting anything good out of the studio. I sit down in front of Ableton and I just can't seem to think or anything. I guess sometimes the best thing to do is not to think, but that's a different story. So I usually ask producers this question: what do you do to overcome creative slumps, and do you go through them frequently? Like, what's the process that you kind of go through if you do occur kind of a slump as such?
I would say music frustrates me now as much as it did when I started. It's still just as difficult, 10 plus years into this journey than it was at the start. But what I will say though is definitely after doing something for a long time, my intuition has got a lot better. So even though I might get frustrated or I'll come up to a point where I don't know how to progress or I've got like a writer's block, the thing with experience, I think this is with anything, is my intuition's a lot better now. So maybe back in the past when I was trying to create a certain sound or I listened to a certain producer, I'm like, how did they get that sound? And YouTube it or try to search for it or do whatever, ask your friends, and you just come to a point where you couldn't figure it out. I think now after a long period of time, my intuition's better. So where that would stop me, I think, okay, I know how to go here now, or I go to this synth, or I'll go to this sample pack or whatever, just to try to help me through that period. So it takes experience to get through, um, you know, writer's block or mental blocks, I guess. Like everyone says, it's a bit of a cliche, but I listen to a lot of different music. I listen to like heavy metal. It's probably like people don't probably know this about me. I listen to a lot of like hard heavy metal. I listen to rap. I love rock music from the 60s and 70s. So I'm really never listening to dance music or electronic music if I'm not making it or if I'm not at a club. So I'm not really one of those people that are listening to dance music at home if I'm not in the studio. So giving myself a break from that style of music helps me, I think, as well. Another thing too, I don't know if I've just figured this out for myself once, or if it was through someone that told me, but another nice way to kind of get through writer's block is to study the music that you love. So what I would do is I would take a track from a producer that I look up to or that I like. Let's just take DeWalter as an example. So I'd load DeWalter's track into Ableton and I'd loop 15 seconds of it and I'd try to write down what I heard. Like how has he got to this point? So I'd write down, I can hear a kick, I can hear a clap, hi-hats, maybe I can hear 5 different hi-hats. Maybe he's got an open hat, a closed hat, a ride, whatever. All right, what else has he got going on here? I can hear a pad. And before you know it, you've written down 20 or 30 sounds. And I think that's a big thing for new producers too, is the importance of layering and the importance of the different layers that it takes to make a track. Like I know personally, my tracks won't sound complete until I'm anywhere between 30 to 50 layers of a track. And that you can hear when a track doesn't have enough going on or enough layers in music. If you can make a successful track with 10 layers, then fair play to you. That's amazing and that's going to be a hit. But I think the importance of understanding that it takes a lot of layers, even incidental sounds that you can't necessarily hear or you can't pick out, but they make up like the cake, I guess, the different layers of how it works. So yeah, what I would do if I ever got stuck is I'd take my favorite song, mentally break it down and understand how to critically listen to something. That's a really important part of what I learned when I studied too, being able to understand, what you're hearing, like what you're listening to. And sometimes critically listening can ruin you, can also destroy you. If I'm in the car driving somewhere and my wife looks at me and she's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, can't you hear the reverb on that snare? Like, why did they do that? So sometimes it can kind of get in your head a little bit too much. But understanding how to critically listen to something to learn what makes up the music that you're inspired by or the music that you're into. Yeah, that's a really good tool. Just writing down, and then you understand that you've got to kind of, experiment, find these different sounds to get through those mental blocks.
Yeah, that's some really good advice. I would second that. Sitting down and sort of, like you say, pulling a track into Ableton. It's something that I've been doing quite a lot recently. Just sort of
Also a
using them
reference
as
track,
reference
yeah.
tracks for mixing. Which makes sense. the importance of layering is really interesting for our kind of music. But those people who make tracks with just 10 channels, they've got melodies, and our music doesn't necessarily have a melody, right? It has elements that make up, like I said at the start of the podcast, you can listen to a track and it may sound the same all the way through if you just flick through it, but actually it's constantly evolving and changing throughout. So yeah, that's really, really good. So, just one other question that I just really want to circle back to something that I forgot to ask you at the start, because you did mention at the start that you've noticed, and you said maybe you've noticed that producers are kind of changing the sound to fit the trend at the moment, and I've noticed that so much over the last couple of years. Personally, I'm a little bit spiteful and won't change my sound as a result because everyone seems to be doing it. But as an artist that's releasing music on a high level and constantly playing shows, do you feel the pressure to change your productions as a result of the ongoing trend?
I wouldn't say the pressure to change my sound, but it's no secret that the sound of this underground scene has changed in the past few years. Like um, I have these conversations with other producers all the time. Just in general, I think maybe since COVID, there's been more energy in the music. Like minimal music's great, and I'll always love it, and you need patience to listen to it. But in Sydney, in particular, and I can only talk about where I live and the scene that I'm in. We came out of COVID, and people had all this pent up energy, all this built up energy they wanted to get rid of. So the music sped up. You probably noticed that the BPMs have got quicker. People wanted kind of hands in the air moments a lot more, and the patience for minimal was like the last thing that people wanted. People didn't want to come out of COVID where they were locked up for a couple of years and stand there and sway and listen to druggy minimal music. So that kind of, it's particularly in Sydney, it got phased out. But I don't feel pressure to change my sound. I would say if I was stubborn and just stuck to playing dark minimal, then there'd be no gigs for me in Sydney, or there'd be no future for me. So I have tried to consciously change my sound, and I like house music just as much as I like minimal music. I love it all. But it's funny too, where you asked me before about having your own sound. So I've tried to put more energy into my music in the last 2 years, I would say. And for me, it sounds more housey, and I play it to my friends. They're like, "Oh, it just sounds minimal." So I don't even know where I'm going with this. Is more house? I'm not too sure, but you can just tell just generally in the scene, it's moved to more towards house music, which I'm okay with. I love house music, and I play it all. But yeah, I don't feel the pressure to do it in particular. It's more just I don't want to get left behind and not be like applicable anymore. I don't just want to be this old minimal guy that never changed his sound and was stubborn and didn't keep up with the times. In a way, I'm not going to sell my soul, but you know what I mean. I kind of just have made my stuff a little bit more housey in the last couple of years.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, personally, I can't tell because this recent release, the Perceive release, I'd say that's still on point with your sound, and the one that you've got coming out on Daydream is probably the slowest track I've heard of you for quite some time as well. So, but I understand. I listened to your After Hours mix that you did recently, and that is a change. I was like, okay, he's definitely.
But that's also something too. People hear my productions and expect a certain style of DJing, and I DJ always differently. I always more lighthearted when I DJ. So I've found that too with DJs I've seen over the years. Production and DJing can be different, very much so. Like I don't want to name drop too many people, but yeah, I've definitely become a fan of certain producers through their music, saw them live DJing, went, oh, this wasn't what I expected. So for me, I've always leaned towards a bit more house and a bit more energy when I DJ. And I don't really play much of my own music, to be honest. I do test it sometimes, but it's boring to me to just play my own music. I like to, like any other DJ, get excited when I find new music, and that's kind of what I play.
You may have already mentioned this, but just to wrap up here, I'd really like to understand what tips you would have for the up and coming producer. There are a lot of producers that listen to this podcast. There's a lot of DJs that listen to the podcast as well that don't produce, but I try and gear each episode to a specific audience, and this one's obviously more towards the producer. And I know that a lot of people who click on this podcast will be wanting to understand your production tips. So if you have any tips for the newer up and coming producer, or maybe even the DJ, what would they be?
Well, look, I think I've touched on a few of them over the course of this chat, but try to, if you can, have the mentality to finish all the projects that you start. Try not to get stuck in loop jail, like we said before. Try not to get stuck at that point. Yeah, for me, just being able to look back at the tracks I made 2 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 12 months ago, if you've just got half finished projects on Ableton, you can't really do that, and I can pull up my iTunes where I have all my music, and I can look at all the tracks I've made over that time. So, in 2022, I might have 10 unsigned tracks rather than 30 half-finished Ableton projects that I'd have to scroll through and open and audition. So just having a body of work makes it easier. I would definitely say learn the tools that you have. It's just a natural thing to always want the next thing, to always think that, I'm going to get this drum machine, it's going to change the way I work. It's not. It's actually going to slow you down in a way, because you're going to learn that new tool and then incorporate it into your production. So not to disparage you from buying new tools, but learn what you have first and foremost. Really understand how to use your tools, whether that's your DAWs, whether you're learning Ableton, or how all the different built-in plugins work, which I use a lot of, even on my current setup at the moment on my computer, I use probably no more than 5 VSTs. So I use one for bass, I use one for pads. I use a lot of different engineering ones for mix downs and fine tuning EQ and compressors and stuff like that. But like having 60 different synthesizers, that's great if you know how to use 60 synthesizers, but I can pretty much guarantee you don't. So just understanding the tools that you have, understanding the tools that you have in front of you before you start buying all these other toys, because they're not going to make your music better. They're just going to give you more tools to learn at the end of the day. Like we said before, be patient, but don't be too patient. So, there's a well-known producer and DJ, Nico Maxon. He now lives in Sydney. He's from the UK, but he's been here for a few years. And we had this conversation too. He's been doing this for a long time, maybe similar time to me. And he said too that, if you wait forever, the opportunities might pass you by. And those opportunities that you think might change your life don't always necessarily change your life. So he went through a period there a couple of years ago. He had an EP on Linear, Arapu's label, and he had an EP on Constant Black, which is is it Bernski's label? Yeah.
Bernski's, yeah. I've got his Linear EP just down here.
There we go. Yep. Yeah. And then he had one more. So he had 3 EPs in the space of 6 months, and he's like, to me, like the door's going to be, they'll be knocking down the door now. Like this is going to change everything. And it didn't, like his life went on, and, that's how it goes. So if you're holding on to music or waiting for the perfect moment, there really isn't one. You've just got to kind of, be vulnerable, put your music out there. And, if you're new to the game, you have to be patient. There's no shortcut to releasing music or having successful music. People often ask me, like, is this ready to release? And sometimes you've got to be honest with people too. Sometimes people send you music that you don't think is going to be there, or you've got to be honest with people too. Sometimes people are too kind about this type of thing, and it's a creative work, so it's a subjective thing. So just because you don't like it doesn't mean it's not a good thing. So I guess be patient, but also I think you'll know too, in a way, when you start to like or enjoy your own music, that's probably a good indication that it's ready to be released or ready to be put out there. So there's always a period at the start when you make music where you don't even know if it's any good, but then when you start to enjoy it, when your ear switches over and you start to actually enjoy your music, that's a probably good indication that it's ready to be released.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome advice. And I couldn't agree more about the Ableton thing. It's something I've had to learn the hard way, always wanting plugins when in reality, everything you need is in Ableton. You don't need anything else. But yeah, I think a lot of producers have to go through that pain just to realize that the key is actually just to learn synthesis to a level where you can use anything, because they're all the same anyway. People just buy them for presets. But yeah, no, look, really, really good advice. And honestly, there's been so many golden nuggets in this podcast. I hope everyone's really enjoyed the content. I know I have. I've got a lot out of it, and I've learned a lot of lessons through this as well. So this is really, really valuable. So I appreciate your time today. I really do. Yeah, yeah. So what have you got coming up next? What's next on the horizon over the next year?
So releases wise, there's a couple of remixes, some on vinyl. Like I mentioned before, a VA on Evaporate, the Taiwanese label. So I have a track on their label. And probably after however long I've been doing this, time for my own label soon. So I've got a bit of music built up that I think it's kind of time. I feel like I've got a story to tell now with the label. I always, was releasing music and never, was just enjoying the ride of releasing music, but taking control of my own label. So controlling the artwork, controlling the music direction, and there's a lot of good producers in Australia that would be nice to highlight too. So, releasing music from my friends, established producers, not just unknown people, but just having a home for my own music, and to release music that I like. So that's probably the next the big announcement, probably towards the end of this year, start of next year, will be my own label. Yeah.
Nice, that's awesome. And do you want to name drop any of those producers that you're looking out for at the moment?
Absolutely, yeah. So, like in Sydney, as far as minimal goes, there's a younger generation of guys that are making kind of minimal house. Tyson Brune, he runs a label called Locomotive. They do podcasts, record labels, so he's making some cool stuff. Tyler Hudson also making some really cool, detailed minimal, which is really nice to look out for. Um, but yeah, in Sydney, probably the most talented and underrated producer is Sun Archive. He's had a couple of releases on, Politics of Dancing and Hoarder. Good friend of mine, Mike. But he's for sure just a studio wizard and an amazing producer and a great DJ as well. Nico Maxon, like I mentioned, he's in Sydney. He's not necessarily an Australian, but he's in Sydney now, and he does amazing stuff. And there's a couple of guys too that not so much in the minimal scene, but on the borders of house, electro, even some techno stuff. Guys like Rhythmic, he's making some really cool electro stuff. Marley Sherman, Carlo Gambino, Bligsy, all these guys are kind of doing some good productions. Dan Bartz and Kemba from the Sash crew, they're also making some cool stuff. So, yeah, as far as Sydney goes, there's a lot of producers here. There's some nice labels that are releasing this music, so it's not going unheard. There's some nice labels releasing this music. What else in this more broader Australia? Down in Melbourne, probably one of the best minimal producers is a guy called Thomas David. He's had a couple of releases out. Again, phenomenal kind of engineer and detailed way of working. Maybe I can put some links in the show notes of some of these things so you guests can listen to some of this stuff as well. But or your listeners, sorry. But yeah, Thomas David down in Melbourne. Also, Cooper Dodge and Michaelis. They run a label called Mood Pilot. Yeah. So again, really, really, really great detailed stuff. Their music gets played around the world. They've got their label called Mood Pilot, where they are going to be releasing some stuff. I think I'll be doing some stuff with them as well. And lastly, probably down in Adelaide, which I've had a couple of gigs down there over the last 12 months. It's a real surprise to me how healthy the scene is down there. A DJ and a producer and a label owner called Dr. Chemtrails. He runs a label called Orbital Drift, which is, again, doing some really cool stuff. He releases so much music and makes so much music too. So he's just a really, really good producer. I was introduced to that scene down there by a guy called Dale. He ran a party called Visitors, not so much a producer, but yeah, just the party scene down in Adelaide is really healthy. Another shout out to a guy called Lenny who runs a party called Inside Out Dance Club. He does a lot of good touring. They had Cosman on Friday night last week. So, I think, there's a lot of good Australian producers, DJs also. So, yeah, I think Australia's in a really good spot moving forward.
Awesome. That's brilliant. Good insights. I'll be definitely on the lookout for some of those people for sure. Yeah, that's great. And finally, where can people go if they want to catch up with you? Like, where can they go to find your mixes, and where can they go to follow you?
So SoundCloud, probably the best spot, just SoundCloud/Venda. Instagram's probably the main social media outlet for me these days. I don't really use Facebook. I think it's a bit of a dying trend over there to use Facebook. But yeah, SoundCloud for my mixes and Instagram to keep up to date with gigs and releases, things like that.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. I appreciate your time. And I will link all the links to his SoundCloud and Instagram and his socials in the description of this podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, the description of the YouTube video. And yeah, hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you all in the next one.
Thanks, Adam.